part 14 of Project E55 ASL, and there's a whole lot of parts that I need to install in the car. For this video, there's the seats, the 6-point racing harness, the fuel cell, the pedal box, the intercoolers, and then also this thing. Well, you guys are later going to see in the video what this thing is. So the goal for this video is to mount all these components in the car, so the mounting points of all these components are figured. Then after that, I'm going to be unbolting all these parts from the car one final time, giving the chassis a quick paint so that everything is final at that point. The fabrication work would be pretty much like 90% complete after that. Well, there is some more fabrication work that you're going to see in the next video. There's some aluminum panels that I'm going to be adding on, and then some attachment points for the carbon fiber body panels. So anyways, quite a lot of work to do for this video. Let's start off by mounting the seats and the 6-point racing harness, and then get to all the rest of these parts. So starting off by just going over some of the things that I've done to the chassis since the previous video. So I've done some finishing up on this back part of the chassis. I've added some caps over here, some extra braces. There's still some finishing up that needs to be done. But I've also added these braces over here. These braces are for supporting this open part of the chassis a little bit, because this open part tends to be the most wobbliest part of the chassis in an open top car. So these tubes provided a bit of extra support. They go all the way up to the attachment points of this bell housing adapter, and the front of the engine is now also bolted to the chassis. These bolting points have made them really temporary for now, because the final bolting points, well, the engine is ideally supposed to be mounted to the corners of the chassis. Like, that's the way the engine is going to provide the most rigidity to the chassis. But the reason I've done it like this for now is because I might be changing this whole thing later on anyways, because the thing I'm not sure of right now is that the engine has a wet sump system right now. It's the factory oil system. I haven't changed that for now. What I need to figure out is that I actually need to drive the car, figure out if this oil system is any good for this car or not. And if it's not, then I might be moving to a full dry sump system. That's why I haven't done any modifications to the oil pan right now. Once I do modify the oil pan, then I'm going to be adding bolting points on the oil pan as well that are going to go to the corners of the chassis. But anyways, getting back to the topic of this video, so you guys might remember from previous videos I mentioned that the seating position in this car is going to be fixed, and the steering column and the paddle box is going to be electrically adjustable. So the steering column is already electrically adjustable. I did that in, I believe, part 8 of the video series it was. So in this part I'm going to be mounting the seats, which is going to be a little easier now since they don't have to move, they have to be fixed seats. That's just to make it easier to pass regulations, because in these open top cars the helmet of the driver does have to be at a certain point, like it has to be a certain distance from the rollover bar, and it has to be below the imaginary line going from the rollover bar to the front hoop. So if the seats are movable, you can imagine that when you move the seats forwards you might not even be within that point. Also, for the 6-point racing harness, all these parts of the seat belt have to line up a certain way with the chassis. I'll talk about that when I get to installing the seat belts. So for mounting the seats, I started off by trying to figure out the right location for the seat. So that aluminum bar that I had on the top was to make sure that my helmet always stays below that point. Once I had the position of the seat figured, next I cut some square tubes so I could fabricate the mounts that the seat will go on. After this, I tack welded these square tubes in place so that I knew the location of these seat mounting brackets where they had to go. Fabricating the other half of the square tube turned out to be a little more trickier, because this square tube, by the way, I didn't design this part in the software at all, so I didn't know what the notching would look like on these tubes. So to figure out, I just used some cardboard and I tried to cut it in a shape that it would fit the other tube properly. And next I used this cardboard template and put it on a square tube and then marked the same shape and just angle grinded the tube in the same shape. The notching didn't really work out perfectly. I was still left with welding gaps, but they were still small enough that they could be filled. Next I put the seat in place again and I tack welded the seat brackets to the square tube that I added. I didn't bother bolting the bracket in place because the seat is going to remain fixed. This is the only position that the seat is ever going to go in. So that's why I didn't bother bolting these brackets. I just welded them straight to the square tube part. So now I have the seats mounted in place, and I was just getting to figuring out the location of these seat belts, like where they have to attach to the chassis, because there is a few regulations, like they have to be in certain angles for these seat belts to pass all the regulations. So this one is actually a 6-point racing harness, so there will be 6 belts. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. These 2 bottom ones are for preventing the driver from sliding into the car, and for the mounting points of these 2 ones, I will still need to add a chassis brace from like this side of the chassis to the other side. It's really hard to see right now. I will have to take the seat out again to make that brace, but at least I'll get the position figured right now. For the mounting points of these two side seat belts, that's going to be really easy because the angle for these ones has to be like from a 45-degree angle to a 60-degree angle. So I'm pretty much going to have to mount them somewhere over here. So all I'll do is I'll just drill a hole in here and add this bolting thing into this, and yeah, just bolt it in here. That's going to be for these side belts. For the back, like these belts, it's going to be a little difficult again because I'll need to add an additional brace over here from this side of the chassis to this diagonal brace on the rollover bar. So because the angle for this belt has to be from a 0-degree angle to a 20-degree angle, it can't be any lower than a 20-degree angle because that's a little dangerous. Like if I were to just mount these seat belts over here on this brace, what would happen is that under, like, let's say if I crash or something, these belts will try to pull downwards, and they can actually injure the driver more than they will protect the driver if they're mounted this way. That's what this additional brace over here is going to be for. For making this tube, I just held it in place using two magnets, and then I marked it using a marker in the shapes I needed to cut this tube to notch it properly. For this one, because the angles were simple enough, I just used my chop saw to cut these angles. This is the quicker way of doing it. I talk more about this way in part 4 of the video series when I was making this whole tube steel chassis. Once the tubes were notched, I just put them in place and tack welded everything together. And next I got to drilling the holes for the seat belts that are going to go on the side, so I just center punched a hole and then drilled it out with a strip drill. Once all that was done, I had to remove the seats one more time so I could add this brace underneath the seats so that for the attachment point of the two other seat belts, the anti-submarining seat belts that prevent the driver from sliding into the footwell. And after that, I just had to finish up on all the welding. Here's a look at the seat mounting brackets after everything is done, and they're looking pretty good. For these bottom ones, for these bottom seat belts, what I did was I ended up welding these eyelets in place rather than drilling a bigger hole over here and then passing a nut through this, because I think this is the stronger way of doing it anyways, rather than compromising the strength of the tube by drilling it on both sides. Plus, these bottom belts have to wrap around this tube once anyways before they go into the seat because they're really long. That's why I'll have to shorten them by wrapping them around the tube once, so that's going to make them really strong anyways. Anyways, the next part that I have to do now is I have to get to the pedal box, mounting the pedal box. Now, mounting the pedal box is going to be a little more difficult than mounting these seats because unlike the seats, the pedal box is actually going to be electrically adjustable, like it has to move forwards and backwards. So for that, I'm going to be using this thing. This is actually a seat rail from the E55. This is the thing that goes at the bottom of the seat that allows the seat to move forwards and backwards. So rather than mounting this thing under the seat, I'm actually mounting this under the pedal box. But I will need to modify both the pedal box and the seat rail for these two things to work together. So for the pedal box itself, first talking about the pedal box, I didn't go with a really expensive aluminum pedal box like you mostly see in race cars. I went with this much cheaper steel one because I knew that I would be cutting and welding this anyways. That's why it didn't really make sense going with a really expensive one and then destroying that one. So what I'm going to be doing with this one is that I'm going to be welding it right on this seat rail over here. The reason I'm welding it and not bolting it in place is because this is really thin metal on both the seat rail and the pedal box. That's why this is definitely not going to be a good place to bolt something. It's really thin metal, and it's definitely not even that big to put any decent sized bolt over here, especially for a pedal box, which would require a lot of strength. So I'm just going to be like scraping all this paint off, welding a seam over here, and then also welding a seam on the underside so that it's really strong that way. But first, before I can do any of that, I will have to shorten this or narrow this seat rail down because the pedal box is actually fairly narrow compared to the seat rail. Narrowing it is not going to be too difficult. All I need to do is I need to cut this shaft, bring this thing closer together, and then re-weld it, and then yeah, basically get to the rest of it. Before modifying the seat bracket, I marked the location of this shaft so that when I cut it and shorten it, I weld it back in the same location. That was important to make sure that the two rails are aligned properly. If one rail starts moving ahead of the other, the whole thing wouldn't work properly. And then it was back to the chop saw again to actually cut and shorten this shaft. After that, I overlapped these shafts with this bolt that I had. It was an M11 bolt actually, and it was the exact size of the inner diameter of these things, just to hold these things together perfectly straight. And then after that, I had to get back to my crappy aluminum spool gun again, because this shaft was made of aluminum. But after a bit of struggling, I did manage to weld it. And once all that was done, I just had to angle grind the paint off and then start off by tack welding everything together. Before welding it, I made sure that both these rails were parallel to each other, because if they're not parallel, then this thing will not move properly. And after tack welding everything in place, I just tested how this pedal box was moving, just to make sure that everything was moving properly. Once all that was done, it was finally time to place this pedal box in the car to figure out where this pedal box had to be bolted to the car. Initially, I just used clamps to hold this pedal box in place, and then I mounted the driver's seat in place so I could actually sit in the seat and get the position of the pedals exactly where I wanted them to be. This was also a pretty good time to test out the seat belts. Once the final location of the pedal box was figured, I made holes in this square tube so that it could be bolted to the back two holes of the seat rail, and the front two holes actually did line up with the chassis brace, so the mounting points for those ones were actually really easy to fabricate. After this, I put the pedal box back in place and I got underneath the car and marked where I had to cut the steel tube, because this tube needed to be notched on a few places so that it could fit onto the round tube properly. Here's a look at the pedal box after everything is mounted in place, and it is all looking pretty good. Like, everything is mounted really firm, nothing really moves around or anything. So for these back two mounting points, I added this square tube over here. There's still some finishing up left to do on this square tube, but I'm going to do that later because I do have to remove this whole pedal box right now one time so I could paint everything. But for these front two bolting points, these worked out really easily because they were on a chassis brace, so I just had to weld these two bolting points over here. And other than that, this part over here, by the way, right now it's open, but later I'm gonna add an aluminum panel over here so that this motor and everything is gonna be covered. And that foot panel is gonna move with this pedal box, so that's also gonna move forwards and backwards. So yeah, in terms of ergonomics, at least everything is looking really good. Like, everything lines up exactly where I would expect it to be. At least for my height, everything works out perfectly. Even the view from the driver's seat is pretty amazing. Like, everything lines up pretty well. Like, the top of the steering wheel lines up with the top of the front hoop, and the intake manifold, the suspension, literally everything is in a straight line, so the visibility is pretty good even with such a low seating position. That was something that I tried to get right in the design, and it's pretty amazing that it has worked out exactly like it was in the design. But anyways, now that all this is done, next what I have to get to is installing the fuel cell. So talking about the fuel cell, this is just one of those regular aluminum fuel cells with foam inside it. You might have seen these fuel cells in like drifting cars, some time attack cars. It's pretty common actually. This is not the FIA approved one, by the way. The more expensive ones are the FIA approved ones. Those ones have a rubber bladder inside them, and they're extremely safe. Even if they get crushed, nothing leaks out of them. With these simple aluminum ones, what happens is that if these get crushed, there is a chance that they might spill fuel. Talking about the location of this fuel cell, so the fuel cell is going to go in this region over here. It's going to go right next to the transmission and the passenger side foot well actually. But the reason I chose to place the fuel cell over here is because it works out to be the center of the wheelbase of the car, so the level of the fuel is not going to affect the balance of the car. And then also for safety, it works out pretty well because there's no chance of the fuel cell being damaged in a crash. The only time it can get damaged is in a side impact. If someone bashes really hard into this side part of the chassis, it might get damaged enough to damage the fuel cell, but there's a really small chance of that because this part of the chassis is ridiculously strong. So yeah, it's a really safe location to mount the fuel cell. Mounting the fuel cell actually turned out to be the exact same process as mounting the pedal box. I just had to put the fuel cell in place. Two of the holes actually lined up with the chassis braces, so I just had to mark them like where I needed to add those bolting points. For the other two bolting points, I needed to notch square tubes again and weld them in place so that I could add bolting points there as well. Once all the tubes were in place, it was just a matter of marking where I needed my holes and then just center punching the holes and then drilling them out, and then actually welding bolting points there so the fuel cell could actually be bolted there. And once the fuel cell was bolted in place, I also put the passenger seat back in just to make sure that there was still space for the passenger to actually sit in the car. Here's a look at the fuel tank after it's mounted in place. So these are the outlets where the fuel pump is going to attach to. So the fuel pump, I'm planning to mount it somewhere over here. And this is also a really decent place for a surge tank. I'm not planning to run a surge tank for now, but later I am planning to add a surge tank in here as well. The benefit of a surge tank is that you can run the fuel all the way till the really low level, and then the car never really starves on fuel that way. If you don't have a surge tank, what could happen is that this tank is, by the way, it does have foam inside it, so it's not like the fuel is going to be splashing all over the place. But the thing is that if you're going through long corners, it can happen that sometimes the fuel pulls up on one side of the tank and then the outlet doesn't really get any fuel. So that's what a surge tank is there for, that it collects the fuel, and the surge tank always keeps some fuel inside it, so that even when you're running really low levels of fuel, the car will still keep running fine. With this one, without a surge tank, I think I will need to have like half a tank of fuel all the time for the car not to be too much of a risk of the car starving on fuel. These two things on the top are for the return lines. I'm planning to only use one of them for the return line. For the other one, I'm going to use it as a fuel filler. I'm not planning to run this one because later what I'm going to do is that this whole thing is going to get covered. So the transmission, the fuel cell, everything, this is going to be covered by like panels that are going to go over here. Even the drive shaft, actually. Well, the drive shaft is going to get covered even sooner when I make the transmission tunnel, which is probably going to be coming in the next video. But yeah, when I cover this part is not going to be accessible, so what I'm thinking is that I'm just going to run a line from here to like somewhere on the side of the car, and then have a pump to actually pump fuel into the fuel cell. That way is going to work much safer, and it's going to be easier, because on time attack events what happens is that, well, for a car like this you can't really drive it to the gas station and fill it up that way, so I will need one of these fuel things to fill this car up with fuel. So with a pump, I can just drop a pump in one of those things and then pump fuel into the fuel cell using a small external line that is going to connect somewhere over here. So that's going to make it really easy to refuel the car that way. I won't have to worry about opening this part and filling fuel in here, which also is pretty dangerous because you can spill fuel somewhere inside the car, and when there's carbon fiber all underneath the car, the floor and everything, carbon fiber doesn't really go too well with fuel. But getting to the thing I have to fit next on the car, it's the intercoolers. That's the last thing I have to do for this video, fit the intercoolers. The intercoolers, by the way, have to go somewhere over here, like this location of the car. I just need to go back to the design quickly and confirm the final location, like where these intercoolers have to mount. For mounting the intercooler, I just held the intercooler in its proper place using two axle stands. After that, I took some measurements and it was back to the chop saw again to cut these flat bars to size to make brackets that I needed to fit to the intercooler. Once all the brackets were cut and drilled, I just bolted them to the intercooler and then welded them to the chassis wherever they had to go, and that was literally all for mounting the intercoolers. Here's a look at the intercooler after it's mounted in place. Just these little brackets that are holding it in place, and well, it is pretty strong. It doesn't move around too much. I'm not bothered to reinforce it for now, because the thing is that later what you'll see is that there's a whole side pod that is going to go over this intercooler, so that's going to give it more strength anyways. And the position also might look weird right now, why it's placed at such a sharp angle, but the thing is that later when the side pod is here, it's going to draw, there's going to be an inlet somewhere over here where the air is going to be drawn in. The air coming from in between the suspension and everything is going to get drawn into the side pod, go through the intercooler, and then it's going to exit from the side, this part over here. So in terms of airflow, it's going to work out pretty well. It's hopefully there shouldn't be any problems in terms of air intake temperatures. The induction system is also going to be really small. The turbo, there's going to be one pipe going from here to the intercooler, and then this pipe is going to go to all the way from here to the throttle body. Same on the other side. The other side has the same exact setup. So now that pretty much all the components of the car are in place, next what I have to do is that I have to unbolt everything and take it apart, which might seem really stupid right now. But it's because I have to give the chassis a quick paint now, because there's a few parts of the chassis that are already starting to get rusted. That's why I don't want to leave it exposed anymore, and plus the fabrication work after this point, there's not going to be an awful lot of fabrication that's left. The only thing that's going to be coming up in terms of fabrication is making the rear crumple zone. And also this part, there's some aluminum panels that are gonna be riveted on the sides, and also the firewall that is gonna separate the engine and this whole thing. That's also gonna be a big aluminum panel that is gonna go over here. But anyways, yeah, what's gonna be coming in the next part is starting work on putting all the systems of the car together, like the cooling system, then the braking system, the clutch. Connecting the clutch again is going to be fairly easy, the fuel system, and then once those systems are done, then I'm going to be getting to installing a standalone ECU and AEM Infinity. And believe it or not, like you guys are literally just 3 or 4 videos away from seeing this car running. The bodywork is still gonna take a while, and the finishing and everything, but at least the car should be running in like 3 or 4 videos from now. Hopefully my goal is to get everything done by the end of the month. So yeah, hopefully in the next video you guys should see a ton more work done to the car, and hopefully some of the systems of the car, getting them working. But yeah, this is gonna be everything for this video. Thanks a lot for watching, and see you guys in the next one.